This presentation will cover writing the body of your research paper or writing the middle. The first thing you need to know is you will be often asking the question, so what? A research paper is mostly made up of this question. You want to focus on it as you include information in your paper. So you might start asking yourself questions like, why is this example important? How does this point tie back to my thesis? What does this quote add to my discussion? If you ask these questions as you go, this will help to decide what order to include things in, as well as how you can tie them together. So we're going to be presenting quite a few things today that will help you to add more to your so what in your essay. The first thing is by focusing on expository writing. Most research papers use expository writing, which is primarily informative, that is, to provide information for the reader. However, the secondary goal of expository writing is always to persuade. This means that every sentence should be in your essay for a reason and have a point to it. If you have a purpose for each of your sentences, each paragraph, each example, each fact, each piece of evidence, then all of your essay combined will make a point. So don't put anything in there that might be considered fluff. Instead, focus on how does this sentence further the information in my essay. Here's a checklist that John Trimble has come up with to help you with this idea of so what. So to make sure your essay meets the guidelines, check for the following. First, make sure you have a sure sense of audience. This means that you are aware that your audience is people in your class. This means people of the same reading level as you, people of the same understanding level as you. So you want to make sure that your vocabulary is not too advanced nor too basic. Another thing would be to have a well-defined thesis. We've covered this in class several times now, but I really want to emphasize the fact that your thesis needs to be good. You can't use a fact, you can't use a question. It needs to be a strong thesis in order for your essay to continue from there. You need to have a clear strategy for how you're going to outline your essay. This is why I want you to do an outline before writing your essay. You need to lead us through the information clearly. Strong evidence kind of goes without saying. You have to provide strong research in a research paper. You also need what's called a clean narrative line. I want you to think about your paper as a story. If you were to tell a story to a child and were to halfway through change a character's name or jump to a different setting, they would notice. And so when you're telling a story, you have to keep things consistent, but you also have to give us a sense of where the story is leading us. Good novels and good movies give us that sense of we know where the story is going. We may not know how it's ending, but we do know where we're going. Also, you'll need a persuasive closing, and so that will be covered in the next presentation over closers. A good quote by John Trimble in his book Writing with Style, which we do keep coming back to, is good writers are sticklers for continuity. They won't let themselves write a sentence that isn't clearly connected to the ones immediately preceding and following it. They want their prose to flow, and they know this is the only way to achieve that beautiful effect. This quote is a great one to keep in mind as you're writing your research paper. You need to write each sentence on purpose to connect to the previous one and to the next one. So always keep in mind where your writing is going. This is very difficult to do, so sometimes it takes a lot of revising to make sure that each sentence does this. A couple of ideas for you. First, I want you to focus on beginning your paragraphs. Every paragraph should begin with a bridge sentence. Bridge sentences link information from the previous paragraph to the new paragraph. You always use it at the beginning of each paragraph rather than the end of the previous one. That's a mistake I see sometimes. It's always a beginning sentence. And you focus on one main point per paragraph. This might be a sub point in your essay, but it is one point that you're trying to make in that particular section of your essay. So here's some ideas for you for bridge sentences. And all of these come from the article, But What's a Dictionary For by Bergen Evans. but I'm assuming you probably have not read this article, and so you don't really know the content, but based on these 4 different examples, we should be able to tell roughly what each paragraph is discussing. So the first bridge sentence is, what underlies all this sound and fury? Now this is a question, so the paragraph will answer the question. And so this paragraph is going to talk about what underlies sound and fury. Now sound and fury kind of sounds like an argument. So that means the previous paragraph would have discussed the argument, and this paragraph is going to discuss what came behind the argument. So we're going backwards a little bit. We're trying to look a little bit deeper. And by using this bridge sentence, we can tell that. The next example is, so monstrous a discrepancy in evaluation requires us to examine the basic principles. This paragraph will cover the basic principles. Seems pretty obvious. Now, the previous paragraph then had to cover whatever this monstrous discrepancy is in evaluation. We don't know what they were evaluating, but we do know there was a discrepancy in it. And so now we have to go backwards a little bit and discover what the basic principles are in whatever the subject is. The next example of a bridge sentence, more subtly but persuasively, it has changed under the influence of mass education and growth of democracy. Now we don't know what the word "it" is, but we do know it has changed, and the previous paragraph talked about changes, and this paragraph talks about changes. This paragraph will discuss the changes with education and democracy. The previous paragraph also discussed changes, but compared to education and democracy, they were less subtle, but also less persuasive. And the last example is, an illustration is furnished by an editorial in the Washington Post. This would be a good example of a bridge sentence you could use to discuss one example, like an entire anecdote could be an entire paragraph. And so you might use a bridge sentence like this to lead us into it. So these are just examples of how you can use bridge sentences to help us see what the previous information was and how that connects to the new information. So think of it kind of as a comparison between the two. The next thing I want to talk about is signposting. This can also help lead your reader through your essay. This will lead your reader through your essay by hinting about what will be discussed. So if you have 3 examples, you want to say something like, 3 examples will bear this out. The first example, the second example, and so on and so forth. It's helpful to number things if it's appropriate. Another thing you can do is look at your information and see how they relate to each other as far as complexity, or whether something is a strong argument versus a weak argument. And so if you, for example, used your strongest point last, you might say something like, finally and most seriously. This helps us to see the relationship between the main points you are covering in your essay. Other things you might consider are transitions, and so this is just a list of transitional words and phrases. You certainly can write these down, but you can also Google them. I encourage you for the research paper to use a transition you've never used before. I'm going to talk about 2 things that I want you to really remember for writing the middle of your essay. They will enhance your essay if used correctly, but can really detract if used incorrectly. So the first one is using headers. Headers are allowed in your research paper as long as they meet the criteria listed on the screen. You have to use bold font for your headers. You need to use Roman numerals as well and number them in order. You need numbers for your headers. They're sort of pointless without numbers because we need to see where we are in your paper. Do not use one before the introduction. It should be pretty obvious that we're reading the introduction. Transition between each section, that's probably the mistake that most students make, is they just don't transition. They sort of write separate essays. And so you want to make sure there's a good strong link between each section, and then don't use one before each paragraph. Instead, think of big sections. So I would say the majority of students are going to have maybe 3 or 4 headers total. Don't do one in front of each paragraph because then it looks like an outline with paragraphs in it. So here's an example. You have to imagine that this is a full essay. Writing about Saskatchewan, so we would have a nice developed introduction with our thesis statement and its important city. And then we'll probably do an extra space just to visually separate it, and then we have our first section, which is geography. And I could even title it Geography of Saskatchewan. And then we would have our first paragraph, which would be kind of the major geographic regions, and then the next paragraph might be the climate, and then we might have 2 or 3 other paragraphs in there as well. And then we will move on to the second section, which is history. And notice that our bridge sentence connects immediately back to the point prior to this one, which is geography. So we want to make sure that we make that strong connection between the two. Finally, the other thing that you can do in this essay is to use block quotations. Block quotations are direct quotes that are longer than 4 typed lines, and they have to be offset from the rest of the text. You can use them in your essay as long as you follow these requirements. First, you have to follow the MLA format for using a block quotation. It means they have to have an introductory sentence or phrase, and they have to be double tabbed in. It has to be longer than 4 typed lines before you block it, not after. And so this would be as you're typing along, you've reached 4 lines on the screen, not 4 lines in the original. And then you can only, I want to repeat that, you can only use one block quotation. So make sure you choose a good one. Really choose it based on content, what's going to work best in your essay. So here's an example. If you notice, this is the paragraph that our block quotation is in. We have an introductory sentence, and then we've got our really nice introduction to the block quote itself. This is a full sentence introduction. You could also do a phrase. Then we have our block quote, and you can tell it's a block quote because it's been double tabbed in. The entire thing is set off like a block. It does not need quotation marks. You might have an in-text citation if your introductory phrase or sentence does not include the author, and then we finish the paragraph down here. You need to put it in the middle of a paragraph, not at the end or beginning, because we need context in front of it and after it. Then you can see down here we've moved on to our next paragraph. So it's all about the tabbing and then making sure that you put it in there correctly. You can use this block quote. They can add a lot to your essay as long as you quote something good. So be looking in your resources for a nice good chunk of information that you would want to include. So those are some tips and tricks for writing the middles of your research paper.